This is Council Weekend, and today is the Ascension of Catholic Council of Women's Council Sunday. Members will be at all the doors with these brochures following the Mass, all the Masses. Brochures are also in the cafe at the info booth. We invite you all to join. I know that, sorry about that. Our council is the best I've ever seen. They are active. They do so many good things in the community. They are a cohesive group of women that work for the betterment of the parish, for me, and they're very supportive of me and everything that we do here at Ascension. So I would invite you to, ladies, prayerfully consider joining. Monday begins with a social hour. This week is their first meeting, and the meeting starts at 7. The social hour starts at 6. I have rescinded the 18th Amendment here, okay, just so you know. If you don't know what that is, it was prohibition. Okay, now to our message, and all of you online, welcome once again. We are in the 5th and the final week of our first message series of the fall season. It's called Realign, and there's all kinds of uncertainty in the world these days. But one thing remains constant. Jesus Christ calls us to follow him today, just as he always has. That is certain. And he calls us as a church to support one another as well as seeking to follow him. We've spoken about how we all wish to be more loving people, how we all have room for improvement, but that we tend to see people as the world sees them, defined by politics or ethnicity or income. In short, the world puts people into categories and classes and causes, and that diminishes their real worth. God does not judge anyone's worth in any of those ways. When we come to see people as God sees them, it is easier for us to love them as God loves them. The goal of this series has been to align or realign our view of people with God's view. We began the series by looking at the fact that God forgave us a debt that we could never have repaid, so that when others hurt or annoy us or just get in the way, he teaches us to cancel their debt. Never easy, but we love people best by forgiving them, just as God has forgiven us. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the importance of generosity. We talked about how being as generous as we can, as often as we can, to those that we can. We talked about really considering other people, about paying attention to them, about keeping on the lookout for opportunities to serve them. And last week, we looked at how to deal with people when we are frustrated with them or their behaviors, when they are making choices that we don't like. And instead of trying to control people or worrying about them, we can hand them over to God through prayer. We also encouraged you to get into a small group. Group relationships, like the CCW, support primary relationships. They bring us together as a church community. Today, we're looking at a key way of loving people that we often look at as really more difficult than it has to be. And to do it, we once again are looking at a parable from the Gospel of Matthew. The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast. Excuse me. And no, I will not wipe my brow with this one, okay? The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast. Matthew says that Jesus again is speaking in parables. Now, parable is a Greek word. It refers to illustrations in the form of fictional narratives, and it's used in rhetoric to advance an argument. As we know, Jesus used this form of argument all the time. What's his argument here? His argument here is that the kingdom of heaven is real. And he used 3 stories because people love stories. His stories always brought unexpected twists and turns that forced people to stop and actually think about them. The truth of the story, the value of the story, needs to be discovered. And in reflecting on parables, the truth can sneak up on us. We can accept some things that we might not accept otherwise. And this was definitely true for the chief priests and for the elders who opposed Jesus. They didn't like him because they were jealous of him. In the parables, Jesus gives them an opportunity to slow down, to see the truth, even if they don't like him. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a wedding, a big one. In the Jewish culture, there was no bigger party than a wedding feast. They meant more than they even do now. A wedding feast would not just last for a day, it would last for an entire week. And everyone in town would come out to a wedding feast because it was a huge break from the tedium and the drudgery that characterized daily life. There would be food, and drink, and dancing. So the wedding would be a big deal. But the wedding that we hear about today is an even bigger deal. It's given by a king. And let's face it, a king would have had the best party possible. Richest foods, choicest wines. No expense would have been spared. And to be invited, it was an honor, it was a privilege, and it was a tremendous opportunity for good food, if nothing else. So, of course, everybody would come, right? Wrong. The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests, but they refused to come. This was absurd, so much so that Jesus' audience probably laughed out loud. Nobody would refuse to come. A second time, he sent out other servants, saying, "Tell those invited, behold, I've prepared my banquet. My calves, my fattened cattle are killed. Everything's ready. Come to the feast. Everything is waiting for you." This second invitation is even more pressing and more urgent. And likewise, the response is more pronounced. Some ignored the invitation, went away, one to his farm, another to his business. Previously, they had refused the invitation. Now, they ignore it and instead turn to routine daily lives as if no invitation had been made. And worse still, the rest laid hold of his servants and mistreated them and killed them. At this point, the absurdity of this story turns dark. They murder the king's servant, and in turn, they receive justice from the king. But he still wants guests for his party. So he says to his servants, "The feast is ready. Those who were invited were unworthy to come. Go out, therefore, into the main roads. Invite to the feast whomever you find." So this first group, this select group, proved themselves unworthy. Why were they unworthy? Simply because they rejected the invitation. Worthiness before the king is completely determined by a willingness to accept his invitation. And since they proved themselves unworthy, The king's servants look for anyone who will accept that invitation. The servants went out into the streets. They gathered all they found, bad and good alike, and the hall was filled with guests. End of story, right? They fill the hall and they have a party. Well, in a parable, someone is usually God, and someone usually represents us or the people to whom Jesus was addressing that parable. In this parable, obviously, God is represented by the king. The wedding feast is heaven. Over and over again, Jesus describes heaven as a huge wedding banquet and feast. The guests who refuse to come to the party represent the chief priests and the religious rulers to whom he was speaking. They're the ones that are rejecting his teaching. They are the ones who would be responsible for his death. But they also represent anyone else who feels like they are too good for God. They represent people who think they are better off without him and refuse the invitation. They represent people who are so proud that they ignore the Lord's invitation. Meanwhile, Jesus is calling us to identify specifically with the king's servants. Jesus tells us that we should humbly see ourselves as servants. We are servants entrusted with wonderful good news in the form of an invitation from the Lord to those who don't follow him. And while some people do reject or ignore God outright, I think many stay away from God and especially from church because the invitation is either misrepresented by church people or it's misunderstood by unchurched people. The invitation for many turns into everything about judgment and guilt, religion, religious rule-keeping, dogma and doctrine, arcane rituals and ceremony. And they believe that an invitation to church is about being holy, being worthy. Meanwhile, the fact that worthiness is predicated wholly and only on our willingness to accept the invitation. And that invitation is to a life-changing opportunity for more successful living now with more rewards later. Our strategy started under Father Gavin and carried on, hopefully, here at Ascension, is to invest and to invite. To invest in friends, in family members, in co-workers, through the very things that we've been discussing in this series. Paying attention to people, serving them, adding value in their lives. I have told you, sorry to tell you again, some stories of my experiences at my previous parish in Port St. Lucie. Surprisingly, I chat up most people that I meet. I know that surprises you. But I got to know people at the drive-thrus, at fast food places, and at Walgreens. And over time, they asked what I did. And when I told them, and they recovered from their shock, they asked where I was a priest. And I invited them. I said, just stop in. We're welcoming, we have great music, the people are friendly. Just give it a try. Do you know that there were 3 people from those places that became regular attendees at weekend masses? Really? And my weight continued to balloon as I ministered to the fast food industry. But I'm telling you that story so that you realize you can make connections almost anywhere. And it's not forced, and it's done over time, and it's done by inviting, not by pressuring. We invite, we sow the seeds, God does the watering and oversees the growth. So we ask you to keep this in mind as we go forward. Connect when you can, and when appropriate, actually invite them to come to church. You never know. God can do wonderful things.